Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. This story is a gritty crime thriller with hard-boiled elements following McCarthy, a hardened man caught in a deadly game of blackmail, betrayal, and murder. As he navigates a world of corrupt lawyers, ruthless thugs, and dangerous women, McCarthy is forced to confront his own moral boundaries. Themes of justice, revenge, and survival pulse through the plot, as McCarthy seeks to unravel the tangled web of deceit while facing the consequences of his past decisions. With betrayal lurking at every turn and violence simmering beneath the surface, the story explores the fine line between heroism and complicity in a world where everyone has something to hide. Concealed Weapon by Torrey. Black Mask, December 1938. Marge and McCarthy show no mercy to a blackmailing murderer. The man came weaving down the hall of the office building, and McCarthy said to Marge Chalmers, "Geez, that guy's got $7 worth of start. What a load." McCarthy turned and slammed his office door, the spring lock taking hold with a click. The stranger in the hall lurched into Marge and would have fallen if she hadn't held him up with a short but sturdy arm. McCarthy said pleasantly enough, "Hey guy, take it someplace else. You better go somewhere and sleep it off." The man's face was a dingy white. Even with Marge's support, he stood bent and twisted. He muttered something, and McCarthy said tolerantly, "All right, guy, I didn't hear you. But you ain't the first to get this way." Marge said, not tolerantly, "You should tell him that. You of all people." Then, with a total change in tone, "Pat, the man's hurt." The man proved it by quietly falling on the floor despite Marge's attempt to hold him erect. He went down in a loose and sodden pile. Marge looked up from him and snapped, "Pat!" McCarthy was already in action. He stooped and tore the man's coat open. Seeing the blood mottling the white shirt, he said, "Oak, kitten, we won't move him. Call the ambulance and the cops. Quick. If we move him, it might make it worse." "What is it, Pat?" McCarthy pointed to a half-dozen holes in the bloody shirt. "Maybe an ice pick, I don't know. But they're in his belly, and that means he shouldn't be moved. Get going." Marge took his keys and opened the office. The police came after a little while, cars full of them, as did the ambulance. McCarthy watched Dr. Solari straighten up from the wounded man, and the smart young doctor said to him, "Maybe we're in time. Unless the fellow gets a transfusion inside the next few minutes, he'll be shaking hands with St. Peter." "How bad, Doc?" McCarthy asked. Solari had a smooth and unlined face. He looked about 20 but had 10 years of experience and a reputation as an authority on the sort of violence police encountered. He stared at the ceiling, as though examining something new and different, and said, "Well, he's been pierced through and through with something. I'm not prepared to say exactly what, but if this had happened down in Colored Town, I'd say the weapon was an ice pick. They favor that down there. Ice picks don't come under the head of concealed weapons. Now this man has 12 wounds in his abdomen and has lost some blood. The shock was slight, owing to the nature of the wound. He will most certainly have peritonitis, as his intestines are most certainly pierced through and through. He may survive if he isn't too far along to react to a transfusion. Now, does that answer you, Mr. McCarthy?" McCarthy said, "In a big way, Doc. It means the guy's got a chance, don't it? If he gets a transfusion immediately, I'm having him removed to the hospital at once." 2 husky, white-coated men came in with a stretcher. They lifted the now unconscious man onto it, with Dr. Solari assisting. Then came an outraged bellow from the outer office. A voice rang out distinctly, "Hey, Miss Marge, I got to see the chief." McCarthy muttered, "That damn Benny," and went through the knot of policemen into the outer office. Benny Cohn, McCarthy's pet cabbie, was at the door. He apparently didn't want to stay there, but 2 policemen, who had him by the arms, were winning the argument about where Benny was going. or staying, Benny saw McCarthy and stopped struggling. "Hey, Chief, I come up to see you, and it seems I can't. They tell me I got to stay outside." McCarthy said, "Let him go." Marge, who'd been awaiting the doctor's report, said, "Personally, I think one of us ought to see about a transfusion for this man. He fell into our arms in front of your office. How is he?" "He might make it. What do you want, Benny?" "I'm busy." Benny said, "And so am I, Chief. Like I say, these cops won't let me in to see you. I got to see you, Chief. No fooling, I got to see you." "What about?" Marge broke in with, "Does the doctor think he'll live if he gets a transfusion?" Benny brightened and broke away from the two policemen. He said to McCarthy, "Hey now, Chief, if it maybe is the guy needs the same kind of blood I got, maybe you can fix it for me. I took the test, they give you $35 for it, and I got my name on the list for giving it. Maybe you can fix it for me, Chief. I got to have the dough. What do you want to see me about?" "That's it, Chief. Dough." McCarthy said, "Then I certainly will try to fix it. If you can earn it, it's better than me having to give it to you." Marge said, "But Lord, what will the harvest be? With the man full of Benny's blood?" McCarthy fixed it with no trouble. The wounded man's blood was typed in a hurry and found to match Benny's. McCarthy and Marge left the hospital, McCarthy grinning, and he said, "That's the easiest $35 I ever made in my life. I'd have had to give it to him if he hadn't made it this way." "Why?" McCarthy said uncomfortably. "Well, you know how Benny is. He never makes any dough out of his hack, and now he's jammed." "How?" McCarthy sounded even more uncomfortable. "Well, he's been running around with some gal. He got in a little argument with her and slapped her. And she says, unless he pays for the 3 teeth he knocked out, she'll have him thrown in the sneezer. Swell kid, Benny is. Hell, baby, if Benny thought I wanted somebody's teeth knocked out, he'd do it for me just as quick as he would for himself. He's that way." "That's just it," Marge said warmly. "He's always getting you in trouble over things like that. You know he is." McCarthy led the way into a bar and grill and changed the subject effectively. He fanned out 5 brand new $100 bills and said nothing. Neither did Marge for a moment. Her blue eyes bulged and she finally gasped, "Pat, where did you get that?" McCarthy said, in a complacent voice, "From the guy, kitten. Before the cops came, before they took him into my office. He had $540 in his wallet, besides a few cards, and I left him the $40 and the wallet. I told the hospital I'd guarantee his bill, though, so it won't be all clear profit." "But Pat, it isn't your money." McCarthy looked injured and dragged out some cards. He held one out to her, and she took it and read, "Billy Tucker's Roadhouse." She said, "What has a man named Billy Tucker got to do with you taking the stabbed man's money?" "Turn it over, kitten." Marge did this. The card had McCarthy's name scrawled in pencil on it, as well as his office address. He said, "See, it's got my name on it. The guy was probably on his way up to see me when he got stabbed. So this is my retainer. I can't be expected to work for nothing. And anyway, he can't use it right now, and I can." Marge shook her head and said, "Let's look over the rest of the cards. What do you suppose he wanted to see you for?" "Probably to keep from getting stabbed," McCarthy said, spreading out the cards. There was one that read, "The Silver Slipper, Dine and Dance," one of a chop suey place, and another advertising a particularly poor brand of bourbon, and a bar that sold it. The Silver Slipper card had a telephone number written on it, and an explanatory note that read, "Small, blonde, drinks Scotch, Marie." McCarthy grinned at this and said, "The guy's got an idea, card indexing his women." He put the card down by the one bearing his address and name, then frowned. He pointed out, "Hey, look, the same man didn't write 'em both. Look." The writing was decidedly different, and Marge agreed that this was so. She said, "What difference does it make? Probably none. Maybe the blonde wrote her name and number for him. She wouldn't have gone into details about the Scotch if she had, Pat." McCarthy shrugged and looked at more cards. One was of Ira Halstead, attorney at law, and this was new and unsoiled. Another, equally new, was that of James R.S. Wilson, and then there were two more bar cards, which McCarthy discarded after looking them over for more telephone numbers and descriptions of girls. He studied the lawyer's card and that of Wilson and said, "This Wilson is a big shot broker, very strict church member and the rest of that stuff, and this lawyer Halstead has something to do with him, but I can't remember just what." "Why not ask him?" McCarthy said. "Maybe he wouldn't tell me. I'll get a guy from a newspaper and ask him." Chet Morris was the newspaper man McCarthy picked for an information bureau. He was short, fat, and almost bald, and he had a notorious passion for checked and wildly patterned suits. McCarthy opened up with, "Hi, Chet. That's new, ain't it?" Morris looked down at the plaid affairs that made him look even more roly-poly than ever and said, "It's half paid for anyway. It looks good." Abe Goldstein, who worked the police beat for a rival paper, snickered and said, "It looks good, hell. It looks just gorgeous. Just too simply gorgeous." Morris managed a sickly grin for McCarthy. He gave Goldstein a cold and haughty look and said, "Yah, well, it cost me $60 anyway." The unimpressed Goldstein said that the tailor had certainly seen Mr. Morris coming from a distance and recognized him as the chump he was. He also said his brother-in-law, who was in that business, could duplicate the plaid job for not a cent over $35, but that the said brother-in-law ran a quality store and would not have a piece of goods with a pattern like that in the shop. Morris gave up the argument and said hastily to McCarthy, sniffing the press room, "You want to see me, Pat? Let's go outside. I got to get fresh air every so often around here." Goldstein's voice followed them out with, "That's quite a breeze you got on your back, Chet, and you can't get an argument against it from the next 5 guys you meet. What do you know about Mr. James R.S. Wilson?" "A big shot, as I remember about him," McCarthy asked. Morris took off his horn-rimmed glasses and started a polishing job. He said, "Right, a very big shot. Chairman of the community chess drive last year, selectman of the Trinity Church, president of Wilson, Marks and Lenihan investment brokers. A very big shot, to be sure." "What about a lawyer named Ira Halstead?" "Another big shot, a different kind. He's the people's friend, if you know what I mean." "I don't, Chet." "Well, he takes damage cases against railroads and such, on contingency, of course. Some people might call it a form of blackmail, but as long as it's a big company that's stuck, who cares? The jury always goes for the poor devil who's suing the heartless corporation, don't they? So that makes him the people's friend, because he doesn't ask for a retainer when he takes that kind of a case. What does he get?" Morris put his glasses back on and wiped his bald spot with a handkerchief he'd used to polish them with. "Well, usually half the damages the jury gives the victim. Less expenses, of course, but he gets big damages for his clients, and very often there's a few bucks left over for them. A very few, though, I'd say. A nice guy, I can see. Not in trouble with him, are you, Pat?" "Not yet, anyway." Morris's round, good-natured face showed worry. "He's got connections, if you know what I mean. We lay off him in the sheet, if that means anything." "It does, Chet. Thanks a lot." "Is that what you wanted to know?" McCarthy said, "Yeah. It made me remember something. It made me remember that Halstead is the lawyer for some guy that's suing Wilson over a car accident. I remembered it when you said he took damage cases." "Wilson is the sort of bird he likes to tackle," Morris agreed. "I don't keep up with things on this damn police beat. It's all I can do to keep up with the cops." "And Goldstein," McCarthy suggested. "Abe can take the hide off a man's back with that tongue of his." Morris said sadly, "Worse than that. He just about took this suit off my back a minute ago, and the thing is brand new." "I still say it looks good," said McCarthy and left. McCarthy went from the police press room to the paper Morris honored with his services. There, he looked over the clippings on the car accident James R.S. Wilson was involved in, studying them thoughtfully. He finally grumbled, My stabbed man can be either William Bowes or Antonio Giovanni, and he didn't look Italian. He left the newspaper morgue for a drugstore phone booth and telephoned the hospital. He said, "I'm McCarthy. What about the man who was stabbed in my office building?" He held the phone, far from patiently, for 10 long minutes before he got the doctor in charge of the case. The doctor said, "He's doing as well as might be expected, Mr. McCarthy. The police are here now, waiting for the man to recover enough to make a statement. This in spite of my telling them the man will be in no shape to talk for at least 24 hours. They don't know who he is yet?" McCarthy asked. "Apparently not. That fact seems to worry them, I might say." McCarthy said, disagreeably, "It always worries the police when a man is stabbed. They're paid to worry about such things." He consulted the phone book and got Ira a Halstead's address and telephone number, then studied the phone thoughtfully for a moment. Finally he grumbled, "Might as well go, he wouldn't tell me anything over the phone anyway," and then went hunting for a cab. Halstead's law offices looked stately and dignified, but Halstead looked like a boy barely out of college, like a boy who'd majored in athletics. He shrugged his bulky shoulders, lifted calm brown eyes from McCarthy's card, and said, "My secretary told me it was about one of my clients, Mr. McCarthy. Will you explain?" "I'm trying to identify a man," McCarthy explained. "He had nothing in his pockets but your card, and I thought possibly you might be a help. He's a man of about 40, weighs around 150. He's got sandy hair and eyebrows, and when I last saw him, he needed a shave. In fact, he'd needed one for the last couple of days. He wears a brown suit and hat and white shoes. The shoes needed cleaning. He has a scar along his jawbone, not very long but still noticeable. Can you think who that might be?" Halstead studied the problem and then shook his head. "I don't recall any client who that describes. You say he had my card in his pocket?" "And that's all he had," McCarthy lied, leaving out all mention of Wilson's card and the 5 new $100 bills. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. McCarthy." "It wouldn't be Antonio Giovanni, would it?" Halstead laughed. "Antonio Giovanni is at least 50. He isn't over 5 feet tall and must weigh at least 200 pounds. He talks broken English, very broken English. He's been in this country 30 years or more, but he acts like an immigrant to this day." "What about William Bowes?" McCarthy was watching Halstead's hands and thought one of them tightened almost imperceptibly. When he looked up, he noted Halstead's eyes had lost their warm frankness and now looked wary. Halstead said, as though surprised, "Now I never thought of him. Bowes does answer that description to an extent. By George, it might be Bowes at that." McCarthy said, "I thought it might be. Is the man in trouble?" "He's my witness in a rather important case that's coming to trial shortly. As a matter of fact, the Giovanni case. By George, that's why you spoke of Giovanni. You associated the two in some way. Where is the man now?" "In the hospital. He was stabbed." Halstead shook his head and said, "Poor fellow. If he dies, it will be too bad for my client, I'm afraid. I was depending on his testimony to show negligence on the part of the driver who killed his son." "You mean Wilson?" Halstead nodded and smiled. The warm look was back in his eyes. He leaned forward and said, "That was an unfortunate thing. Mr. Wilson was driving along and struck young Giovanni, killing him instantly. 2 days after that, this man you speak of, William Bowes, got in touch with the elder Mr. Giovanni and told him he'd witnessed the accident. I may add that Mr. Wilson got in a panic immediately after the accident and drove around some time before reporting the matter to the police. You understand that makes him technically liable to a hit-and-run charge. Bowes insisted Mr. Wilson was entirely at fault. How? How was he wrong on it?" Halstead said in as friendly a voice, "Mr. McCarthy, I am a lawyer. I can't ethically answer your question. I don't understand your interest in the matter unless you should be investigating the matter for Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson is opposed to my client, and I can't very well tell you our case against him. I hope you will understand." McCarthy got to his feet. "I'm not investigating it for anybody but myself. At least not as yet. But this man Bowes was stabbed in front of my office door, and there was a reason behind it. I'm naturally interested in it." "Well, thank you, Mr. Halstead." Halstead stood as well. "Is the man in bad shape, Mr. McCarthy? Will he recover?" "The medicos don't know yet. He's at the Sisters of Mercy Hospital. You can keep in touch with them." "I'll certainly do that," Halstead said, following McCarthy to the door. "And thank you, Mr. McCarthy, for telling me this. As I said, Bowes is the backbone of our case. If he should die, I'm afraid we haven't one." McCarthy shook hands and left the office. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, then headed for another phone booth. He got the Central Station and Detective Lieutenant Shannon and told that big Irishman, "I think the guy that got stabbed in front of my place is named Bowes, William Bowes. You might do a little checking on it. He's a witness in a damage case against Mr. James R.S. Wilson, if that means anything to you." Shannon whistled and said, "He's flying high, Pat. I'll look into it. How'd you get it?" "From Halstead, the lawyer who's suing Wilson. The lawyer this Bowes is a witness for. And Shan, here's something funny. I didn't crack about where the guy was, or what had happened to him, or a thing that would tip Halstead off. But I talked as though something had happened to him, and Halstead let it go. He seemed to think the guy was dead. Then he caught himself on it and changed it to asking questions." "Does that mean anything?" "What should it mean?" Shannon asked cautiously. "Well, it should mean you should keep a police guard on this Bowes, if it's him, until he's out where he's got a chance to fight for himself. This Halstead is supposed to be a smart baby. That's why I talked to him the way I did." "He's smart, all right." "He's too damn smart," said McCarthy. "I don't trust these baby-faced boys that don't look as though they'd ever spoken out of turn in their life. They're the kind I watch because they're too good to be true. I'll be seeing you, Shan." "Why are you angling around on it, Irish?" McCarthy said bitterly. "Well, I think the guy was coming to me for help when he got the shiv in him. I don't like to lose clients that way, even if I haven't really got 'em at the time. And then I'm a socialist or something. The poor guy didn't have any money, and everybody else that seems interested in him has. Wilson and this lawyer Halstead both. I want to see the guy get a break." "What do you get out of it?" "Well, exercise at least," McCarthy said, "and maybe practice." Benny Cohn was waiting for McCarthy by the time he got back to his office. Benny's nose was swollen out of shape, his left eye was a lovely green, and adhesive tape held down a plaster on his left cheekbone. McCarthy stared at him and said, "What the hell happened? Did you ever see one of these iron things like they press pants with, Chief?" Benny asked in a plaintive voice. "Well, I take the 35 smackers I get at the hospital, and I go down to pay off this gal I was telling you about, and Chief, guess what happens?" McCarthy said, "I don't have to guess. I know. She clouted you with the iron." "Wrong, Chief, wrong. I dodged the iron, except for it bouncing off the wall and falling against my neck, sort of. But when I duck the iron, Chief, she unbuckles herself and comes at me with the ironing board thing, and she lands with it. I run like hell, Chief, and no mistake." "Did you give her the 35? "I never had a chance. She started in throwing that iron thing when I put my head in the door and say to her, 'Hi, sweetheart.' Right then she starts. I mail that 35 to her, Chief, I mail it. And I get another 35 from you tomorrow or the next day, the doc says. From me. The doc says you're paying the shot, Chief, and that I should come to you for the dough. So I'll be here." McCarthy estimated how long $500 would last if the man in the hospital had a daily transfusion at $35 a copy. He groaned. Benny said helpfully, "He must be a pal of yours for you to pay off like that. The doc says he may be in there for the next 6 months, on account of his guts being all cut to hell. I bet it cost you a pretty penny, Chief. A pretty penny." "Will you get out?" McCarthy said. Benny went out. He poked his head around the door a moment later, however, and said, Hey, I get thinking about getting smacked in the puss with that iron board arrangement, and I forget. You're to call Miss Marge, see, Chief. Your phone rings and it's her and she says to call her up. How long ago was this? Just now, Chief. Benny left for the second time, and McCarthy called Marge's number. She said in a rush as soon as she heard his voice, "Oh, Pat, I've been trying to get you. It's Chet Morris. He tried to get you, and when he couldn't, he called me. He went up to see that Wilson man and told him you were checking on that accident thing or something. I didn't tell him that. He said that after he talked to you, he got thinking and remembered that lawyer was suing Wilson, and that he thought there might be a story in it, and went up to see about it. He said Wilson was very nice, but that he got telephoned at the paper almost as soon as he got back from seeing Wilson, and that somebody told him to lay off and keep out of what didn't concern him. He thinks that means you, too. He said he didn't want to see you get in trouble." "Little Mother Morris," said McCarthy sourly. "Why did he have to tell Wilson I was looking around?" "He said he didn't think it made any difference." "Well, it probably doesn't," McCarthy said, and made a dinner date for 8 that evening. Marge said, "Why not at 7? I'm hungry now." "I've got to see this Giovanni guy that's suing Wilson first, hon. It may take me a little time to find him." "I see." "You be careful, Pat. It worries me about what Chet Morris said." McCarthy laughed and said, "You and Chet would make a good pair. You both worry." Antonio Giovanni owned a small and messy vegetable store in the center of Italian town, and it was there McCarthy found him. Antonio was on the floor and on his face, and he'd apparently been trying to crawl under a long tray-like metal affair that held vegetables beneath a spray-like arrangement. The tray, possibly 4 feet wide, sloped down toward the front of the store for a display, and Antonio was sprawled partly under this, looking like a large and very dead frog. Water from the spray had seeped through on him and washed part of the blood around him away, but there was still plenty left. He'd had long, sweeping mustaches, and one was soaking in blood, while the other hung like a brush toward the floor. McCarthy, without touching anything, knelt and looked, and thought he'd never seen such a pitifully ridiculous corpse. He saw 3 small, round and purple holes in the cheek turned toward him, saw another in the part of fat neck in view. He cursed silently and viciously and stood. A voice from behind him said, "Hey, where's Tony?" McCarthy turned fast. He saw a small and dirty boy of around 10, with black curly hair and bigger and blacker eyes than McCarthy thought were possible. He gulped and said, "Tony isn't here right now. You run along and come back by and by." The boy said, "Ma says for him to come to supper. She says she won't wait, that it'll spoil. Where is Tony?" "He's out right now." The boy said reflectively, "Ma'll raise hell with him when he comes home. She says all he does is run along and talk to lawyers and that the store ain't run right anymore." "Is he your dad?" asked McCarthy, going a little sick. There was no resemblance between the dead man and the boy, but he got the answer he dreaded. "Sure. I'll go back and tell Ma he ain't here. If you see him, tell him supper's ready." McCarthy said he'd surely do that, and watched the boy swagger out. He decided that Tony had been an indulgent father, and that the children had rather taken things into their own hands, basing this on the good nature still showing in the dead man's face, and on knowledge of other decent, kindly, honest Italian people he'd met. He went out of there, head down, and deciding he would not be the one that broke the news of Tony's death to his family. He called the station and told Shannon what he'd found, and Shannon cursed luridly and asked him to go back and stand guard until he could get a radio car on the scene. McCarthy did, praying the youngster wouldn't be back looking for his father. Chet Morris was at Marge's apartment when McCarthy arrived. He was again polishing his glasses, and his mild, near-sighted eyes peered up at McCarthy as he said, "I'm sorry, pal. I guess I spoke out of turn to that big stuffed shirt. How was I to know he'd take it the way he did?" You told him I'd talk to you about him? That it? Yeah. I didn't stop to think about it. He put his glasses back on, and this cleared his vision. He looked McCarthy over and said in a different tone, "What's the matter with you, Pat? You look sick." McCarthy said, "I am sick. Marge, honey, how's about a drink? I thought I could take it, but I guess I can't." Marge brought the drink and said anxiously, "What's the matter, Pat? What's the matter with you?" "I want to kill a man, this bird with the ice pick. Him or the man who hired him. That's all. I didn't know I could get so crazy mad that I'd be sick." Morris asked, "What's happened?" And McCarthy told them both. Morris started toward the phone, saying, "I'll telephone it in." With the guy in the hospital getting it the same way, it's a story. They may not get the connection. McCarthy said with no inflection, "You touch that phone, Chet, and I'll beat you to a pulp. I'm praying God that nobody will see there is a connection. That other business didn't rate much of a spread, and maybe nobody will add 'em together. I'll work it my own way, Chet. Let the other boys handle it. You're off shift." Morris said, "If you say so, Pat, but give me a break when the thing smashes." "If it smashes," McCarthy said bitterly, "it's going to be hell to lay it on that guy. You don't accuse men like Wilson of having murder done unless you can prove it, and he's got no motive." Marge said, "Chet told me all about it. This Italian man was suing Wilson for damages. If he was dead, he couldn't sue, could he? That's why that other man was stabbed too. They tried to kill him so he couldn't testify. It stands to reason, Pat." McCarthy said wearily, "Oh, use your head, Marge. Giovanni was asking for 25 grand, claiming Wilson was driving carelessly. Wilson is very wealthy, and what's 25 grand to a man like that? He'd pay it in a second rather than have anybody killed. It ties up some way, but we haven't caught the angle yet." The phone burred, and Marge answered it and then said, "It's for you, Pat. It's Lieutenant Shannon." McCarthy took it and said, "Yeah, Shan?" And Shannon blurted out, "You called the turn on it, Irish." "You sure did. I had a man on guard up at the hospital, and 2 guys came in and tried to kill that Bose guy. One of them even got in the room. That's the one that got away down the fire escape. I should have seen that they put him someplace where he was easier watched." "What happened?" "Well, this man, his name's Dugan, was sitting out in the hall. He admits he was talking to some nurse, or maybe it wouldn't have gone as far as it did. 2 men came up the stairs and walked down to Bose's room, and Dugan finally gets wise to himself and asks them what they want. One of them pulls a gun and starts using it, and Dugan kills him. The other ducked in Bose's room and down the fire escape, and Dugan missed him 3 times running. He's going to put more time in on the range or get off the force, and I told him so. Was Bose hurt? Hell no. They've got him doped up so he won't roll around and tear himself up anymore, and he didn't even know anything happened. Has he talked yet? He can't, and the doctors wouldn't let him if he could." "Who was the man the cop killed?" "Some bird named Weeks, just a hired hand." "Did Dugan see the one that got away well enough to identify him?" "No, he was talking to that nurse like I said. He wasn't paying any attention to what he was supposed to be working at. I'm going to see he gets a month's suspension without pay if I have to resign to get it." "You coming down?" McCarthy said not that evening, and then he asked if the man the policeman had killed had happened to have an ice pick on his person, and found he hadn't. Then he said to Marge and Chet Morris, "Let's eat. Chet, why don't you come with us?" Morris said, "Don't think I'm not. I'm sticking close until this thing's settled. I'm scared, Pat, and I'm not fooling." Marge said, "I'm afraid about Pat," and McCarthy said, "And I'm afraid the cops will get to the ice pick guy before I do. I want to be first." It took McCarthy the best part of a week to find that Mr. James R.S. Wilson was maintaining a small apartment in a discreet apartment house, and a small blonde girl who fitted the apartment. The small girl's name was Mrs. Martha Abbott, or at least that name was accepted. Her husband was Mr. James Abbott, supposedly a traveling man, but his travels only extended from the Wilson brokerage firm or the Wilson house to the apartment. It took $25 of what was left of the $500 for McCarthy to get details, but he thought it money well spent. He said to Marge and to Chet Morris, who was arrayed in something new that shocked the eye, "The guy's keeping her all right, but in this day and age that's no crime, and I'm damned if I can see that he's doing anything else. I've tagged him back and forth, from his house to his office, from there to this apartment, and I haven't seen him do one thing that would tie him up to any of the rough stuff. Of course, I can't tell just who he sees in his office, but he's too cagey an old turkey to meet some hoodlum there where the help could spot it. I've got a boy on the day shift and another one on the night shift to tell me if he meets anybody there at this apartment, and they say he doesn't." Morris asked, "Does he know you're following him? If he does, he hasn't done anything about it." Marge said firmly, "He's a nasty old man, or he wouldn't be doing things like that." Morris said, "Did you ever see his wife?" "No, why?" "Well, I did, when I went to see him. I don't blame him a bit. She'd drive a man to drink." McCarthy asked what woman wouldn't, and Marge slapped half-heartedly at him. She said, "What are you going to do now, Pat?" "Keep after him, of course. He's bound to make contact with his hired killers before long, and I want to see him. He's the only lead to them I've got. I wish you'd drop it. After all, it's none of your business." McCarthy said, "You didn't happen to see old man Giovanni stretched out like I did. You didn't see this poor kid of his. You didn't go to the old man's funeral." "Pat, you didn't go to the funeral!" Chet Morris said. "Pat and some of the cops, mostly Shannon, and some of the boys on my paper paid for it." "Marge, even Abe Goldstein came in for $10, and the guy thinks money is something to hide in a bank. All of them had seen the family the guy left, and it seems he'd given Halstead all the money he could raise to prosecute Wilson for running over his oldest boy. He'd mortgaged the shop he had, and they took it away from the family before they could even have his funeral." Marge said, "Oh, the poor people." There was a knock on the door, and Marge opened it for Benny. He came in, grinning, and said, "Another $35 you owe me, Chief. I'm running you into dough, that's 5 of 'em. You always cost me," McCarthy said sourly. "But not any more, Chief. It seems that I'm getting amnesia or something like that, and the docs say I'm no good anymore. They're going to get another guy until I get fat again." "Geez, Chief, I lose 10 pounds, but it's 17.5 pounds the way I figure it, and that buys a lot of groceries. I'd rather pay you than some other mug." "Thanks, Chief, thanks, I like that." McCarthy explained, "If I pay you, you don't have to borrow from me. If I pay somebody else, I'm stuck with you again." "Geez, Chief, that ain't right. Don't I always kick it back to you?" "You haven't yet." "Well, I never had it yet. When I'm in the dough, I will." McCarthy looked at his watch and asked, "You got the hack downstairs?" "Sure, I'll ride with you then." He said to Marge and Chet Morris, "I'll start after Wilson some more. He gets out of his office in half an hour. He's as regular as the old maid putting the cat out. See you some more." Marge went to the door with him. She said earnestly, "You be careful, Pat. I've got a funny feeling about this. Forget it, kid. He'll lead me to the right guys sooner or later. He has to. They'll contact him sometime. And then I'll step in on him and them both." Benny said from where he was waiting in the hall, "Hey, the guy talked today, when I was doing my stuff with the docs and him. But all he wanted was a priest. He said he wanted to confess. Shannon know this?" "Sure, but the guy wouldn't talk to him. He wanted a priest is all, Chief." McCarthy said, "I'll put Wilson to bed either at his house or at his apartment, and then I'll see Shannon, and we'll talk to the doctors. If the guy can talk to a priest, he can talk to the cops, and he knows things we have to know to get anywhere." "Is he getting along all right?" Marge asked. "According to the doctors, he is." He said goodbye again, and Marge watched him follow Benny down the hall with quick strides. She went inside and said to Chet Morris, "This is Pat down. I never saw him get upset about anything like that before." Morris said slowly, "Well, Here was a case of the innocent bystander being the victim. Worse than that. That killing was so senseless, and there was no reason for the attack on Bose. $25,000 means little to Wilson, and the death of his oldest boy hit Giovanni pretty hard. From what his wife said, he only wanted the money for his family. And then he gets killed and leaves 5 kids, none of them over 10. $25,000 isn't worth that. Marge said, "Maybe Pat's after the wrong man. Maybe he didn't do it or have it done." Morris shrugged his gaily covered shoulders and said, "Don't be silly. If it wasn't Wilson back of it, why should the one witness against him be almost killed? Why should the man making the charge be killed? It doesn't make too much sense, but he's the only connecting link between the two happenings. I wonder where the man Bose got the 5 $100 bills." Morris said, "I didn't know he had any," and Marge told of them. She defended Pat with, "He just took them so he'd have money to care for the man in the hospital. That was all." "Sure," said Morris with no conviction in his tone. Marge said, "Poor Pat. I've got the oddest feeling about him. I'm really worried." "If the cops find out Pat took the 500, you'll have something to worry about," Morris told her. McCarthy walked 100 feet behind the sedate-looking James R.S. Wilson, but Wilson was alone, and McCarthy wasn't. A thin, very dark man was on one side of him, and a heavy but equally dark man was on the other. The heavy man was saying, "Go ahead, Seamus. You've been following him, and he didn't know it, and we've been following you, and you didn't know it. Now we're all going to get together and get acquainted." The heavy man had a hand in a side coat pocket, and the pocket lumped out with more than a hand. His thin partner was just as close to McCarthy, and his pocket bulged in the same manner. He had a high, whiny voice, and he said, "You're a stupid, Seamus. You might have known we was keeping watch on him. You're stupid." McCarthy admitted it with, "I've been told so before, by better men than you two punks will ever be." "Sing high, sing low," the heavy man said, "but if you do it out loud, I'll smear you all over the town. You guys out here think you know something, but you're made to order." The thin man said, "Yeah, tailor-made." Wilson turned into the apartment house, first glancing suspiciously up and down the street, and McCarthy said, "Now what? We go in. Just act right." McCarthy acted right. He went inside and to the elevator as though expected, and the clerk looked at him casually and turned away. They rode up to 3C, and the heavy man said, "You know, Mike, I don't blame the guy for going with the gal here. She's a honey. I don't blame him for going for her." The thin partner said, "Why should you? He's paying for it, ain't he?" "And how?" the heavy man agreed. He said to McCarthy, "Just knock on his door. When he opens it, you just walk in like you owned the place. No funny stuff now." The thin man said, "Hey, wait," and reached over and snapped McCarthy's heavy gun from its shoulder sling. He stuck this in the waistband of his trousers and said, "Okay now, go to it." McCarthy knocked. He heard fluttering sounds inside, and then a girl's voice said, "What is it?" McCarthy got a warning gun jabbed in his short ribs and held silent. The heavy man said, "Electrician, ma'am." There was more fluttering, and then the door opened. The small and blonde and supposedly Mrs. Abbott stood framed in it, a black silk negligee wrapped around what appeared to be herself and nothing else. The thin man jammed his gun into McCarthy's ribs and said, "In." McCarthy went in, accompanied by a small shriek from the blonde girl. The heavy man said in an approving voice, "Now that's nice, lady. That's the way to yelp. If you'd made any more noise than that, somebody might have heard you, and then there'd have been hell to pay for this chump." She said, "Who are you? What do you want?" Wilson's voice said from inside, "What is it, darling?" The girl didn't answer, just backed into the room where Wilson was, staring at the 3 men and the 2 guns that followed her. Wilson jumped to his feet, his face suddenly white, and the heavy man said, "Don't have kittens, mister. We're friends, and I'll prove it to you." He said to his partner, "You watch 'em, Mike," and headed toward the French phone by the window. Wilson said, "Why, what?" and the heavy man grinned back at him over one shoulder and said, "Don't get in a lather, Dad. I'm going to call Halstead. I'll get him to come up and we can sort of talk things over." McCarthy said, "You'd better call the cops, Wilson. This has gone far enough." Then the thin man hit him on the back of the head with his gun, and McCarthy went ahead and fell on his face, and completely out. He came back to life just in time to hear Halstead say, "This is going to complicate things, Wilson. This man possibly has somebody working with him. This is going to cost money to hush up." McCarthy opened his eyes just enough to take in the room. He saw Halstead sitting composedly in a chair with the heavy man standing behind it, leaning on it. Wilson was standing in front of him, looking very unhappy. The girl was sitting on a couch, swinging her foot and admiring an arched instep that held a high-heeled bedroom slipper. The thin man was at the window, looking directly at McCarthy. He said, "Hey, ain't it about time Sleeping Beauty woke up? I didn't rap him hard, Halstead. I just slapped him a little." Halstead said to Wilson, "You're in this too far to back out now, Wilson. If Bose gets a police guard, which he is very apt to do, there'll be hell to pay all the way around." The thin man said, "We'll take him and his copper guard if we have to, Halstead. I never liked cops anyway." He walked over to McCarthy and kicked him in the ribs. McCarthy took it with a limp body and half-opened eyes. It took all the willpower he had, but the thin man turned and walked back, satisfied. McCarthy thought the effort was worth it. Halstead said, "You didn't do so well at the hospital, Mike. If that cop had been a better shot, you wouldn't have done well at all." The thin man spat on the rug, and the girl flared at him. "Damn you, don't do that. You're not in a barn now." The thin man told her where she could go, using some choice language, and the girl glared back and used equally strong words. Wilson looked even more miserable, and Halstead grinned and said to the girl, "Shut up, Martha. I'll handle this." "As I said, Wilson, it'll cost you money. It cost money to buy Bose off. If he'd gotten on the stand with his story, you'd have been tarred and feathered and chased out of town." The girl said, "Yes, Daddy. Think of my reputation. It would have ruined me." The thin man, who didn't seem to think much of the girl, snapped, "Ha! That'd be a day." Halstead said thoughtfully, "There's only one thing to do. Let Mike and Jerry take the fellow out the back way while he's still out. If they meet anybody, they can pretend he's drunk and that they're taking care of him." "And then what?" Wilson asked. Halstead said, "What can we do? He's wise to the setup. You're wrecked if we don't get rid of him for you." That was the reason for taking care of old man Giovanni. Bose had told him the story, and you couldn't afford to have him telling it around, could you? Wilson said miserably, I didn't know what you were going to do." Halstead waved his hand and said, "You're in it just as deep, whether you knew it or not. And I'll never think you didn't know what was going to happen. Now, do you pay for us taking this man out, or shall we let him stay here with you? Think fast, he won't be out like that very much longer." Then Benny said from the hallway, "You're damn right he won't." Benny was behind McCarthy, and the shock of hearing Benny's voice brought his head around. Benny was in the center of the door, crouching slightly and holding an iron jack handle in one hand. Chet Morris crowded up behind him, holding a small gun, and he threatened the room with it as he quavered, "Hands up." That started it. The thin man went for the gun he carried under his arm, and Benny went for the thin man with the jack handle. The heavy man jerked at his pocket, and Morris closed both eyes, pulling the trigger of his small gun 3 times. McCarthy was watching the heavy man while lunging to his feet at the same time, but Halstead's head was in his line of vision. He saw a black dot spring out at the side of Halstead's forehead, and saw Halstead put his head down on his knees. Then the heavy man got his gun clear of his pocket, and McCarthy hit him at his knees. The man had a big gun, and it drowned out the echo of Morris's small one when it exploded. But the man was falling backward when this happened, and the slug smashed into the ceiling. The heavy man clubbed the gun at McCarthy, who was hanging stubbornly onto his knees, and McCarthy took the blow on the shoulder. He let go of the knees with an arm gone numb. Then he heard a crunching sound around him and heard Benny say, "Leave him go, Chief. I bopped the—" McCarthy released the heavy man, who showed no further interest in the affair and whose face was now oddly shaped. He heard a screeching sound from the door and turned to see the blonde pounding at Chet Morris with her high-heeled slipper. Morris was fending her off, though not doing well at it. The girl was crying out, "You shot Ira! You shot Ira!" Her voice was a high, thin scream that didn't sound sane. McCarthy looked for Wilson and didn't see him. He heard a door slam above the noise of the girl's keening. He got to his feet and went to the thin man, who was lying with his head twisted in a line with his shoulder. He got his own gun from where the thin man had put it in his waistband. When he reached the hallway, he grabbed the blonde girl by the hair and threw her back across the room. He then crowded past Morris and out into the hall in time to see Wilson dancing up and down in front of the elevator opening. McCarthy set himself sideways, as if preparing to shoot at a target, then called harshly, "Wilson!" When Wilson stopped his mad hopping and turned, McCarthy shot him through the knee. Later, McCarthy told Marge, "We're celebrating tonight, Lamb. Chet Morris and Benny have already started it. They were plastered early this afternoon. They're to meet us here." Marge said, "I can see the reason for celebrating, but that's about all I see. I haven't seen you since it happened." "I had to be with the cops, Honorable. I couldn't get away. There was a lot to explain. For that matter, the cops are still investigating. I asked Shannon to come along too, and he's too busy." "What happened?" McCarthy told her what had happened, dwelling with emphasis on Benny's work with the jack-handle and on Morris's poor marksmanship. He said, "At that, it was a good thing. The guy was a good enough lawyer to maybe slide out of it. He can't slide off a morgue slab even if Morris put him there by mistake. You should have seen that little hellcat of a Martha go for Morris with a slipper. Hun, it was really good. Benny and Morris saved the day when they followed me and came in." "So Halstead was bleeding Wilson all the time? Halstead was back of it all?" Marge asked. "In a way. Halstead had found out Wilson was running around with his tart of a Martha. It was his business to find out those things. He made most of his money by blackmailing. When Wilson ran over the young Giovanni kid, the girl was with him, and he was afraid of the scandal and ran away. Halstead got to the girl, and she told him the truth. She fell hard for him. He was a nice-looking guy, honey." Marge said automatically, "Nobody'll ever say that about you, Pat," and then, "Go on." That's about all. Halstead hired Bose to say he saw the thing. He had to have a witness if he was going to shake down Wilson in a big way. Then Bose got cold feet on the deal and started to back out. Then Halstead put him out of the way. Or had Mike, one of his two thugs, do it. This Mike used an ice pick because they can be carried wrapped up, and they can't be classed as a dangerous weapon if you're stopped by a cop. Get it? I guess so. But why did they kill that poor Mr. Giovanni? They had to tell him Bose was a witness before the old man would consent to start the suit. Bose, when he got cold feet, he calls it religion, but he finally talked to both the priest and the cops, so you can take your pick. Went to Giovanni and confessed it was a frame. So they had to kill Giovanni too. Now is it all straight? I guess so. I'm glad it's over, Pat. McCarthy said gloomily, "It got over too soon to suit me, hon. I wanted that little thin guy that was so bandy with the ice pick all to myself. Benny got to him first. I'll admit Benny did a good job. He broke his neck. The big guy'll hang, and Halstead's dead, and Wilson will be laughed out of town as soon as he gets out of the hospital. Why did you shoot him? You didn't have to do that." McCarthy said indignantly, "Hell, kid, if he'd been a man and faced the music, none of this would have happened. If he hadn't been drunk and out riding around with that chippy, he'd have never run over the Giovanni boy. If he'd have stood the scandal like a man, the old man wouldn't have been killed. I should have aimed center instead of just crippling him a bit. He started the whole thing. I take that Giovanni thing pretty hard, kid." Marge said soberly. "I see what you mean." And then her eyes widened and she said, "My heavens, it isn't possible." McCarthy turned and saw Benny and Chet Morris almost at the booth. They were both very drunk. Benny had a severe and formal Homburg perched exactly in the center of his head, and this didn't go well with a shabby sweater and grease-stained slacks. He carried a pair of yellow gloves proudly in his right hand. His left held a half-full whiskey bottle. Morris looked even more spectacular. He wore a cap on the side of his head, and the suit he wore had been made for a taller, much thinner man. The green trouser cuffs dragged 4 inches on his shoes, which were an ugly yellow. The coat hung almost to his knees. He held 2 glasses and was saying to Benny, "Let's stop and have a little drinky." "Thirsty, I am," McCarthy said under his breath to Marge. "Look at the poor face. That's what the gal did with that high heel." Morris's face was blotched and lumpy, and both eyes were black. He looked as though he'd fallen down several flights of stairs. Marge gasped, "And him so fussy." Then Morris looked up and saw them. He waved happily, almost falling down while doing so, and came to a halt in front of the booth. He beamed at them and said, "Hi, what do you think of the new outfit? Ain't it something, huh?" Marge said, "I'd never deny it." Benny came to a halt alongside Morris and said, "I got me a hat at the same place, Chief." "Hey, look at me too, Chief." McCarthy said, "I can't help it." Chet Morris said in a confidential voice, "Like this, Pat, my friend. Benny and we busted into Abe Goldstein down at the station while you was busy with the cops. Abe's got a brother-in-law who has a clothing store. So Benny and Abe take a couple of snorts or so and go down to get a new outfit. Abe says his brother-in-law's got the best stock in the city, and he helped us pick this outfit out. Didn't cost us nothing at all. How's it look, pal?" McCarthy said, "Gorgeous, simply gorgeous. Will you do me a favor, Chet?" "Sure. Then let me be with you when you see Abe in the morning." "Why?" "He won't take our clothes back. He gave 'em to us. It's funny, too, with him so stingy, but—" McCarthy said, "Let's not spoil our fun tonight, guy. But there's reasons, and you'll realize it tomorrow. Believe me, you will." Marge giggled and said, "It would be bad enough to look at that at any time, but with the hangover Chet'll have, it's liable to be fatal." McCarthy agreed with, "Yeah, fatal to Abe." End of Concealed Weapon by Roger Torrey.